Well, hi, I'm Randall from Randall's ESL Cyber Listening Lab, providing new episodes on language learning, culture, and human development. And today, I'd like to focus on, I think, one of the most important parts of language learning is the ability to see the world through another language. And so that's the title of my presentation today. And one of the things that I also want to focus on is a quote that learning a language is like becoming another person. I think when you begin to learn another language, you see the world in a different way. And of course, many people want to find out, well, how can I go about learning a language better? What are the best tips for learning vocabulary and grammar and so forth? And while those things are, I think, are very important, one of the things that I like to focus on today is just the human experience. In other words, what have been some of my experiences and your experiences that have really led to the way that, let's say, a change in the way that you see the world today? And so, what I'd like to do is to save the idea of the language learning tips and ideas for improving your language skills for another video. But instead, what I'd like to do today is focus on, again, experiences that have shaped the way that I think about the world, the way that I actually teach, and the way that I interact with people overall. So to begin with, I'd like to, and again, during the presentation, feel free to share comments and so forth, especially about your own experiences and what things have helped you in your own human development. So let's go back. I'd like to just start with growing up. I grew up here in the United States in the Midwest, and my mother was from Texas. Her parents, their native languages were, excuse me, was Spanish. And as she was growing up, well, she spoke Spanish, she spoke English a little bit later on, and my grandmother was from Mexico, and she was born in 1908, came to the United States during the Mexican Revolution in 1913. And as they were growing up, at least for my parents, and then later for me, as my aunts and uncles got together with my grandparents, well, they usually spoke Spanish together. And, listening to them, it was like, wow, they were speaking a language from a foreign, country, just a different planet. It was like I was standing on Mars, you could say. I just didn't understand the language at all. And that was, I think, somewhat frustrating. But for me, I was thinking in my brain, well, why do I need another language? I mean, what is the importance of learning Spanish or any other language? And of course, I was thinking with my, teenage brain that, well, language was not as important as, well, I thought it was. And so over time, I realized that I couldn't really speak to my grandparents. They spoke very little. And of course, I could say hello, how are you, and so forth. But I really couldn't communicate with them on a deeper level. And of course, at that time, I didn't really realize the importance of communicating on a deeper level. But that was my first exposure. Growing up, not being able to speak to my grandparents in Spanish. And I was thinking, well, all of my friends speak English, so why would I need to learn another language? But again, my thoughts on this changed over time. Well, when I got into junior high school, that was the first opportunity that I had to learn another language. And in my high school, I had several choices. I had Spanish, German, and French. And as I thought about that, I thought, wow, French sounds like a real exciting language. And as I approached my mom and I said, Mom, I think I want to study French, and realizing that my mom might have tried to teach me Spanish when I was little. I don't remember. But when I told her that I wanted to study French, I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. And I, I realized, oh, I think I'm hurting her feeling because I wasn't interested in studying Spanish. I was interested in studying French. And so at that particular time, I decided to make my mom happy. I studied Spanish in junior high school. And I think when I came home and she practiced some Spanish on me and I couldn't respond, I don't think she was that excited about the way in which I could, interact with her because I didn't know the language at all. Well, a little bit later, when I got into high school, I had the choice of studying languages again, and so I decided, well, let's try Spanish. Why not? But my first year in high school, I had the worst teacher you could imagine because my Spanish teacher only spoke Spanish. Now, of course, you would think that would be wonderful. Your teacher speaks Spanish, you learn quicker. But at the time, again, with my teenage brain, I was thinking, well, why don't you speak to me in English and then explain things in English and then speak a little Spanish? And I would be interested in hearing some of your comments. How were your language learning experiences in high school and college? Did your teachers speak English? Did they speak your language? What was the level of interaction? But So I was with that teacher for 1 year, struggled trying to understand the language. And then finally, at the end of that year, well, the teacher moved on and I got a new teacher in my Spanish class. And I was so excited because now I didn't have to listen to Spanish all the time. Well, at that point, I realized that my Spanish teacher would do something like this. He would say, hola, which means hello. And then he would open the book. He would say, open the book to page 29. We would open the book to page 29. And then he would launch into stories about his travels to Spain and his visits to Mexico. And, well, I think the students were really excited because they heard all of these stories, of course, in English. And I thought it was really exciting to learn about cultures and so forth. But what I didn't realize is for the next 3 years, the class followed the same pattern. Open your book. The teacher sometimes would talk about grammar rules. And of course, in my mind, I always remembered the stories of his travels to different countries. Again, I never felt any closer, though, to learning that elusive foreign language. I mean, Spanish seemed so far away. It felt like an alien language. And so I really couldn't communicate at all. I would call my initial language learning experiences frustrating. And I don't know if any of you have ever felt that and learning a language just frustrating. I can't get this language. I don't understand how this language works. Well, after high school, I went to college for 1 year and then went to South America. And I thought at this point, well, now I'll be able to learn some of the language of my grandparents. But one of the things that I found is that although sometimes I found I was making progress, there were times when I just felt like my language has fossilized, like I couldn't, make any progress. And I started beating myself up, feeling that I don't know if I'll ever learn the language because it seemed like some days I was making progress and then I would, go down. And the other challenge I had was that I found myself comparing myself to other people I met. Wow, they're learning the language and I cannot. And that was extremely frustrating. So not only was I trying to learn an alien language, but sometimes I just would beat myself up because I just didn't feel I was making progress. And it wasn't until years later when I started working with international students that I realized the pains that they were going through. In other words, sometimes I have students that are very frustrated. They're not making progress. And then they have to report back to their parents of why. And their parents ask them, why aren't you in level 29 now, or 6 or 5? Why do you have to repeat the class again? And that was extremely painful. And when you see students with tears in their eyes explaining that they might need to go home because their parents cannot no longer support them, or their parents doubt that they're actually putting in the time and energy to learn a language, was just really disheartening for me. It really made me reflect on my own previous experiences. Well, after I returned, and then I decided, well, I'll become a Spanish teacher. And so I went to college, studied to become a Spanish teacher. And while I was studying Spanish, I also started taking classes teaching English as a second language. And I decided to go in that direction. And then once I graduated from the university, got my master's degree, I worked in the United States for a period of time. And then our family went to Japan. And we were going with the idea, well, let's go for 1 year. And we realized that 1 turned into 2, 2 into 4, 4 into 8. But there were many experiences while I was in Japan that really shaped the way I view language learning even today. And this goes back to the initial thought of learning a language is like becoming another person. And I'm going to reiterate that in my closing comments as well. One of the things that when I was in Japan is that, well, it was just really challenging, I think, in the beginning. Really challenging in the sense that, well, it wasn't like Spanish. And again, feel free that as you're listening to the talk today, comment. I see that there's a number of people have joined, so feel free to share your comments. And I see people from, from someone from Dubai and Brazil, Guillermo also. And so thank you really much. Someone asked that I have Mexican roots, and I do. That my grandmother was from the northern part of Mexico. But going back to my story, when I was in Japan, one of the things that I think one of the stories that really shifted the way that I view language learning happened in 1991. We had been there just for a short period of time, and my daughter, my oldest daughter, then she was 1.5, had a medical problem. I'm not going to share what the medical problem with you just yet, but you're going to be able to figure this out. And I decided to go to the drugstore. And I thought, well, if I go to the drugstore, perhaps I'll be able to, find out, some method of resolving her medical concern. So I walked into the drugstore, and there in the drugstore, there was a man. He was the pharmacist. He might have been 70, 80 years old. And I walked up to him, and I said in English, thinking, well, at a drugstore, certainly they speak English. And I said, excuse me, my daughter has a distended bowel, and I was wondering what you could prescribe for this particular situation. And the man's face went blank. And I realized, I don't know what to say, and I pulled out a dictionary. It was a very, very small dictionary, and I looked up the word, excuse me. And I said, sumimasen. Okay, I'm okay there. And then I said, daughter. I was looking up the word daughter. Musume. Now, I'm thinking in my mind the skills that we try to teach students. If you don't know what to say, try to use different techniques to learn the language. That's another thing that I'm going to talk about in a different video, specific techniques. So I said, sumimasen, excuse me, musume, daughter. And then in this small 1950 dictionary, English, Japanese dictionary, the only word that I could find was this, dekinai, which means can't. So imagine that you're the pharmacist and you hear a foreigner coming in saying, hey, number one, excuse me, daughter can't. What can you imagine? If you're the pharmacist, how can you interpret that meaning? So basically, I did the only thing that I could think of in that moment was to use body language. So I said, excuse me, daughter can't And then I did this. Well, the pharmacist kind of looked at me, turned around, and then walked to the back of the store. And at that moment, I was confused, frustrated, afraid. But then I thought, well, I'll just go home. I'm giving up. I'll just tell my wife that the drugstore was closed. Now, you've never met my wife, but my wife is really intelligent, and I realized that she's not going to believe that the drugstore was closed. But as I started to walk out, I heard some sound from the back, and all of a sudden, the old man was pushing a young man, and he was saying something like this, blah, 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 which I probably interpreted something like this. Listen, you're a university student. You've studied English. Go talk to that foreigner. And I could imagine the young man is saying, whoa, no, 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 no. Do you want your job or not? So the young man came up to me. He said, excuse me. And then I said, and I launched back into that, the initial discussion with the pharmacist. I said, my daughter has a distended bowel. She's been constipated for some time. I'm not sure what to do. And as I began to explain it, the young man kind of nodded his head. And you can imagine what is going on. And at the end of my explanation, he said, excuse me? And then I realized he has no idea what I'm talking about at all. And so at that point, hello, Amanda. I see some other people that are joining. I appreciate it. And again, feel free to share your comments and frustrations about your own language learning experience, because that is the topic of today. And so as I talked to the young man, I basically said, well, he's not understanding my words. I'm going to use body language again. So what I did is, I went, daughter, okay, excuse me, daughter can't. And I went, and the young man did, and I realized he understood. So using some additional body language and so forth, eventually we're able to communicate. My daughter had constipation. She couldn't go to the bathroom, and it was causing her intense pain. So from this experience, I started to realize, well, not only, and again, this is a language learning tip, but not only is this important that we use, language, but we don't give up. We persist in trying to explain our ideas. Well, yeah. Body language is, I see another comment. Body language is the universal language. Absolutely. Sometimes we have to rely on that. But how does this relate to the whole topic that I mentioned right at the beginning? Again, learning a language is like becoming another person. How does that relate to my now being a teacher? Well, basically, it has to do with the idea that when we learn another language, it opens up a completely new world. In other words, at the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned about my grandparents not being able to speak with them. And my mother was one of 11 children. And most of the grandchildren couldn't speak with their own grandparents. And so my relationship with my grandparents was very superficial. But once I learned Spanish, it was a number of years ago, I met with my grandparents for the first time after I had gone to South America, after I had learned Spanish. And for the first time in my life, I had deeper conversations with my grandparents on a totally new level. I found out that my grandmother only had attended school one day in her life, and that she taught herself to read and write. My grandfather only had a 6th grade education. And to understand their struggles, to understand their pain, to understand what it was like to live in a new country for my grandmother, and just to open a new world. And when I talked with my grandmother one time, we were talking about, life and marriage. And I said to my grandmother, "So, Grandma," and my grandparents got married in 1930 during the Great Depression. I said, "Grandma, so where did you and Grandpa go on your honeymoon?" And my grandmother had this blank stare, and with a smile, she said, "We had no honeymoon. We got married and then went to work." And they worked in the fields picking cotton and doing really hard work. And it was really just an eye-opening experience that I saw for the first time that, wow, by learning another language, I can not only connect with my grandparents, but I can connect with so many people around the world. The other thing that has helped me is, again, learning a language is like becoming another person, it has really helped me have greater compassion and understanding for those who struggle. And one of the things that I think that I've learned the greatest, at least with my own students, and I mentioned and I referenced this right from the beginning, is that many of my students come to the United States and think, "Whoa, I'm going to learn English. And in 6 months, I'm going to go from zero to a university student." And they don't realize the challenges. These deal with having realistic goals, something else I'm going to be talking about in a future video. But one of the things that, as I've seen students who have come to the United States, who have struggled with culture, who have struggled with a language, it has just opened the world to say, "I know how you feel just a little bit better. I know what it means to experience heartache," especially when students come, they spend time here, and then realize that they're not able to achieve their goals and then return home. So these ideas of learning a language is like becoming another person, opening new windows to just see people in new ways. And I think learning a language, learning a language allows us to see new ideas because we as human beings tend to see the world through the prism of our own understanding. We see things from a very egocentric worldview. But the more that we learn language, the more that we grow, and the more that we can just see people in a whole new light. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining this presentation. Again, you feel free to share any comment about your own language learning experiences, and challenges and so forth. But I'd like to conclude by just simply sharing with you, people often ask me, "What languages do you speak?" Well, I speak a little bit of English. I speak some Spanish. I speak some Japanese. But I would hope the greatest language that we can learn in communicating with others is the language of empathy, that we understand. We can't always understand people completely of how they're feeling, but we certainly can understand people at a deeper level when we learn another language. I want to go ahead and conclude this episode by thanking those that joined. Feel free after the episode to leave any additional comments. I'll probably be doing these episodes probably once a week with new topics. The next episode that I plan on sharing is about, related to this language learning topic, is about tips. How do you go about learning vocabulary and grammar and culture all together? Because the reality is if we learn a language, but we don't know the culture, we really are, and this is not my statement, but from someone else, is that we become a fluent fool. In other words, we know a language, but we don't know the culture. Well, by knowing both, we can really have a more enriching experience. So again, I want to thank you for joining today. I will be posting more information about future episodes on my website. And again, thank you very much for joining, and I look forward to joining you and listening to some of your other comments. Again, thank you very much for sharing those comments. I see a number of people from Mexico, from Vietnam, from Dubai, from Canada, from Egypt, from Argentina. Again, I want to thank you very much. And if you have suggestions for future episodes, please feel free to share. That's all for today. Again, thank you very much for joining.